Hi guys, it's Mandy here. So on the topic of Snow White, I was looking through my edition of the Grimm's Brothers Fairy Tales, and it turns out I do actually have the story of Snow White in it. So I decided, you know what, I think I will read this to you guys so that you guys can see the difference between the book version and the film version of Snow White. And you guys can decide for yourself which version you prefer. Of course, the book version, being a children's story, is very simple. It hasn't got a lot of detail in it, but it should tell you the story clear enough. And it is quite different. I have already read it through once, and it is very different from the film. So I will read it to you now, and you guys can let me know if you think the book version or the film version is better. All right, here we go. Little Snow White. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a beautiful queen was sitting and sewing at a window with a black ebony frame. And as she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. The red looked so beautiful on the white snow that she thought to herself, "If only I had a child, as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon thereafter, she gave birth to a little daughter who was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. That's why the child was called Little Snow White. The queen was the most beautiful in the entire land, and very proud of her beauty. She also had a mirror, and every morning she stepped in front of it and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror would answer, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." And then she knew for certain that there was nobody more beautiful in the entire world. However, little Snow White grew up, and when she was 7 years old, she was so beautiful that her beauty surpassed even that of the queen. And when the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" the mirror answered, "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but little Snow White is 1,000 times more fair." When the queen heard the mirror speak this way, she became pale with envy, and from that hour onward she hated Snow White. And when she looked at her, she thought that little Snow White was to blame, that she, the queen, was no longer the most beautiful woman in the world. Her heart turned against little Snow White. Her jealousy kept upsetting her, and so she summoned the huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the forest, to a spot far from here. Then stab her to death, and bring me back her lungs and her liver as proof of your deed. And after that, I'll cook them with salt and eat them." The huntsman took little Snow White and led her out into the forest. But when he drew his hunting knife and was about to stab her, she began to weep and plead so much for him to let her live. And she promised never to return, but to run deeper into the forest. The huntsman was so moved to pity because she was so beautiful. Anyway, he thought, the wild beasts in the forest would soon devour her. I'm glad that I won't have to kill her. Just then a young boar came dashing by, and the huntsman stabbed it to death. He took out the lungs and the liver and brought them to the queen as proof that the child was dead. Then she boiled them in salt and ate them, and thought that she had eaten little Snow White's lungs and liver. Meanwhile, little Snow White was so all alone in the huge forest that she became afraid and began to run and run over sharp stones, through thorn bushes, She ran the entire day. Finally, as the sun was about to set, she came upon a little cottage that belonged to 7 dwarfs. However, they were not at home, but had gone to the mines. When little Snow White entered, she found everything tiny, but dainty and neat. There was a little table with a little white tablecloth, and on it were 7 little plates with 7 tiny spoons, 7 tiny knives, and 7 tiny forks, and 7 tiny cups. In a row against the wall stood 7 little beds, recently covered with sheets. Since she was so hungry and thirsty, little Snow White ate some vegetables and bread from each of the little plates, and had a drop of wine to drink out of each of the tiny cups. And since she was so tired, she wanted to lay down and sleep. So she began trying out the beds, but none of them suited her, until she found that the 7th one was just right. So she lay down in it and fell asleep. When it turned night, the 7 dwarfs returned home from their work and lit their 7 little candles. Then they saw that someone had been in their house. The first dwarf said, "Who's been sitting in my chair? Who's been eating off my plate?" said the second dwarf. "Who's eaten some of my bread?" said the third. "Who's eaten some of my vegetables?" said the fourth. "Who's been using my little fork?" said the fifth. "Who's been cutting with my little knife?" said the sixth. "Who's had something to drink from my little cup?" said the seventh. Then the first dwarf looked around and said, "Who's been sleeping in my bed?" Then the second cried out, "Someone's been sleeping in my bed." And he was followed by each one of them, until the 7th dwarf looked at his bed and saw little Snow White lying there asleep. The others came running over to him, and they were so astonished that they screamed and fetched their 7 little candles to observe little Snow White. "Oh my lord, oh my lord," they exclaimed, "how beautiful she is!" They took great delight in her, but didn't wake her up. Instead, they let her sleep in the bed, while the 7th dwarf spent an hour in each one of his companions' bed until the night had passed. When little Snow White awoke, they asked her who she was and how had she managed to come to their cottage. Then she told them how her mother had wanted to have her killed, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run all day until she had eventually arrived at their cottage. Then the dwarves took pity on her and said, "If you'll keep house for us, cook, sew, make the beds, wash and knit, and if you'll keep everything neat and orderly, you can stay with us, and we'll provide you everything you need. When we come home in the evening, dinner must be ready. During the day, we're in the mines and dig for gold. You'll be all alone, and we'll have to watch out for the queen and not let anyone enter the cottage." In the meantime, the queen believed that she was once again the most beautiful woman in the land, and stepped before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but beyond the 7 mountains, this I must tell. Little Snow White is living quite well. Indeed, she is still 1,000 times more fair." When the queen heard this, she was horrified, for she saw that she had been deceived and that the huntsman had not killed little Snow White. Since nobody but the 7 dwarfs lived in the 7 mountain region, the queen knew immediately that little Snow White was dwelling with them, and began once again plotting ways to kill her. As long as the mirror refused to say that she was the most beautiful in the land, she would remain upset. Since she couldn't be absolutely certain and didn't trust anyone, she disguised herself as an old peddler woman, painted her face so that nobody could recognize her, and went to the cottage of the 7 dwarfs, where she knocked at the door and cried out, "Open up! Open up! I'm the old peddler woman. I've got pretty wares for sale." Little Snow White looked out of the window. "What do you have for sale?" "Stay laces, my dear," the old woman replied, and took out a little lace, woven from yellow, red, and blue silk. "Do you want it?" "Well, yes," said Little Snow White, and thought, "I can certainly let this good old woman inside. She's honest enough." So Little Snow White unbolted the door and bought the lace. "My goodness, you're so sloppily laced up," said the old woman. "Come, I'll lace you up properly for once." Little Snow White stood in front of the old woman, who took the lace and tied it round Little Snow White so tightly that she lost her breath and fell down as if dead. Then the Queen was satisfied and left. Not long after nightfall, the dwarfs came home, and when they saw their dear Snow White lying on the ground, they were horrified, for she seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and when they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the stay lace in 2. At once she began to breathe a little, and after a while she had fully revived. "That was nobody else but the Queen," they said. "She wanted to take your life. Be careful and don't let anyone else enter the cottage." Now the Queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my Queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but Little Snow White's alive. This I must tell. She's with the dwarfs and doing quite well. Indeed, she's still 1,000 times more fair." The Queen was so horrified that all her blood rushed to her heart when she realized that Little Snow White was alive once again. She began thinking day and night how could she put an end to Little Snow White. Finally, she made a poisoned comb, disguised herself in a completely different shape, and went off to the dwarf's cottage once again. When she knocked on the door, however, Little Snow White called out, "I'm not allowed to let anyone enter." The Queen then took the comb, and when Little Snow White saw it shine, and that the woman was someone entirely different from the one that she had previously met, she opened the door and brought the comb. "Come," said the peddler woman, "I'll also comb your hair." But no sooner did the old woman stick the comb in Little Snow White's hair than the maiden fell down and was dead. "Now you'll remain lying there," said the Queen, and her heart became lighter as she returned home. However, the dwarfs came just in the nick of time when they saw what happened. They pulled the poisoned comb out of Little Snow White's hair, and she opened her eyes and was alive again. She promised the dwarfs that she would certainly not let anyone inside again. Now the Queen stepped in front of the mirror once more and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my Queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but Little Snow White's alive, this I must tell. She's with the dwarfs and doing quite well. Indeed, she's still 1,000 times more fair." When the Queen heard this once again, she trembled and shook with rage. "Little Snow White shall die," she exclaimed, "even if it costs me my own life." Then she went to a secret chamber where no one was allowed to enter. Once inside, she made a deadly poisonous apple. On the outside, it looked beautiful with red cheeks. Anyone who saw it would be enticed to take a bite. Thereafter, she disguised herself as a peasant woman went to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. Little Snow White looked and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone inside. The 7 dwarfs have strictly forbidden me." "Well, if you don't want to let me in, I can't force you," answered the peasant woman. "I'll surely get rid of my apples in time. But let me give you one to test." "No," said little Snow White. "I'm not allowed to take anything. The dwarfs won't let me." "You're probably afraid," said the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. You eat the beautiful red half." However, the apple had been made with such cunning that only the red part was poisoned. When little Snow White saw the peasant woman eating her half, and when her desire to taste the apple grew stronger, she finally let the peasant woman give her the other half through the window. As soon as she took the bite of apple, she fell to the ground and was dead. The queen rejoiced and went home and asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, are now the fairest of all." "Now I can rest in peace," she said. "Once again I am the most beautiful in the land, and Snow White will remain dead this time." When the dwarfs came home from the mines that evening, they found little Snow White lying on the ground, and she was dead. They unlaced her and tried to find something poisonous in her hair, but nothing helped. They couldn't revive her, so they laid her on a bier, and all 7 of them sat down beside it and wept for 3 whole days. Then they intended to bury her, but she looked more alive than dead, and she still had such pretty red cheeks. So instead they made a glass coffin and placed her inside so that she could easily be seen. Then they wrote her name on the coffin in gold letters and added the family name. One of the dwarves remained at home every day to keep watch over her. So little Snow White lay in the coffin for a long, long time, but did not rot. She was still white as snow and red as blood, and if her eyes could have opened, they would have been black as ebony, for she lay there as if she were asleep. Now it happened that a prince came to the dwarf's cottage one day and wanted to spend the night there. When he entered the room and saw little Snow White lying in the coffin and the 7 little candles casting their light right on her, he couldn't get enough of her beauty. Then he read the golden inscription and saw that she was a princess. So he asked the dwarves to sell him the coffin with the dead little Snow White inside, but they wouldn't accept all the gold in the world for it. Then he pleaded with them to give little Snow White to him as a gift because he couldn't live without gazing upon her. He would honor her and hold her in high regard as his most beloved in the world. Well, the dwarves took pity on him and gave him the coffin, and the prince had it carried to his castle. It was then placed in his room, where he himself sat the entire day and couldn't take his eyes from her. And when he had to leave the room and couldn't see little Snow White, he became sad. Indeed, he couldn't eat a thing unless he was standing near the coffin. However, the servants who had to carry the coffin from place to place in the castle all the time became angry about this. And at one time, a servant opened the coffin, lifted little Snow White into the air and said, "Why must we be plagued with so much work, all because of a dead maiden?" On saying this, he shoved little Snow White's back with his hand, and out popped the nasty little piece of apple that had been stuck in little Snow White's throat, and she was once again alive. As soon as this happened, she went to the prince, and when he saw his dear little Snow White alive, he rejoiced so much that he didn't know what to do. Then they sat down at the dinner table, and ate with delight. The wedding was planned for the next day, and Snow White's godless mother was also invited to attend. When she now stepped before the mirror, she said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the mirror replied, "You, my queen, have a beauty so rare, but little Snow White is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard this, she was horrified and became so afraid, so very afraid, that she didn't know what to do. However, her jealousy drove her so much that she wanted to be seen at the wedding. When she arrived, she saw that little Snow White was the bride. Iron slippers were then heated over a fire. The queen had to put them on and dance in them, and her feet were miserably burnt. But she had to keep dancing in them until she danced herself to death. So that's the story of Snow White as told by the Brothers Grimm. It's very different, as you can tell, from the Disney tale. Disney obviously simplified it. He cut a lot of the attempts to kill her from the queen out of it. Snow White in this story is considerably younger, and I have to say, I personally think that the prince is a little bit creepier in it, to be honest. I actually think the Disney version of the prince is considerably better. A one-time encounter and he kisses her is hardly anything in comparison to him falling in love with essentially a dead person and then insisting on having her corpse carried around because he just becomes rather obsessed with her. I would say this version of the story in parts is better than the Disney version, but the Disney version did simplify it a lot and is in its own way better than this. So yeah, I mean, you guys make up your mind as to whether you think this version of the story is better or the Disney version of the story is better. Personally, they both have their pros and cons. Personally, I think that the prince in both versions is just generally weird. I think they really could do with fleshing him out a bit more and maybe making his relationship with her a bit more substantial, give it a bit more meat so that he doesn't seem so creepy. But obviously Disney's not going to do that because they want to cut the prince out altogether. And frankly, you know what? After having read that, I think you could essentially just cut the prince out and it really wouldn't change much, because apparently, as you heard from that, the prince isn't the one who even wakes her up. It's actually the servant who hits her. So there's quite a bit of difference there. So it doesn't even need to have a kiss in it. Yeah, so that's the story as told by the Grimm brothers. There's not much else to say on that, really, other than the fact it was quite creepy, and you heard the ending of what happens to the queen, and that's the story. There's not much else to say right now. So I'll see you guys in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this one.